Welcome. I'm Elizabeth Mansfield. I'm the Vice President for Scholarly Programs here, and it's my very happy duty to introduce this evening's speaker, Elizabeth Schechter. There is perhaps no more enduring question for humanity and for the humanities than the nature of consciousness itself. And philosophers, for their part, have been trying to account for the wonder as well as the terribleness of consciousness for millennia. Lizzie Schechter's approach to understanding consciousness or subjectivity is, I think it's fair to say, revolutionary, insofar as she pursues her work as a philosopher with a deep understanding of neuroscience and of psychology. Lizzie's research is exemplary of some of the most exciting work being done in the humanities today, in the way that she has developed scholarly expertise, not just in multiple fields, but in more than one discipline. Her capacity to consider a problem using the methods of philosophy, as well as those of brain science and psychology, offers an inspiring model for those of us who believe that humanists and scientists have a lot to learn from each other. Just as important, Lizzie's research encourages us to consider whether the split, forgive me, between scientists and humanists is really as efficacious as our current approaches to education and advanced scholarly research would have us believe. Elizabeth Schechter earned a bachelor's degree in English at Vassar College and a PhD in philosophy at the University of Maryland. She held a prestigious Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in the philosophy of cognitive science at Oxford University before joining the faculty at Washington University in St. Louis, where she is an assistant professor of philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Lizzie to the lectern.
Thank you so much, Cassie, for that very generous introduction, and I am thrilled to be able to speak with you all today. This talk is about the split brain phenomenon. The split brain phenomenon refers to the consequences of a particular type of brain surgery called, colloquially, the split brain surgery, appropriately. Split brain surgery is surgery that cuts through one or more of the cortical fiber tracts that connect the two cerebral hemispheres of the brain, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. This surgery is performed as a treatment for severe cases of epilepsy that haven't responded to non-surgical intervention. It's especially performed for epilepsy characterized by generalized seizures, especially with drop attacks. You can think of a seizure as non-functional excessive electrical activity. In a generalized seizure, this activity typically originates in a single hemisphere and then spreads to the other, affecting the brain as a whole, as a result of which the subject may lose consciousness in a drop attack. These attacks can happen anywhere and with very little warning. They can happen while you're sitting in a classroom or, for that matter, crossing a busy intersection. One of the subjects who underwent the split brain surgeries, which I'm speaking to you about today, once collapsed against a hot stove, badly burning her back. The hypothesis which led to the first of these surgeries in human subjects was that these cortical fiber tracts connecting the two hemispheres might in effect be acting as bridges via which the seizure activity spread from one hemisphere to the other. And the hope in performing the surgeries was that if you got rid of the bridges, the seizure activity would at least be confined to a single hemisphere, sparing the other and allowing the subject to at least retain consciousness during these attacks. But the philosophical interest of the split brain cases has never concerned the surgeries themselves nor the conditions for which the surgeries are a treatment, but instead the long-term psychological consequences of the surgeries. After they are surgically separated from each other in this way, the two hemispheres begin to operate independently of each other in the realm of perception, cognition, and the control of action. In this talk, I'm going to use the split brain cases to address a particular question about persons. Person is a technical term in philosophy. A person is not just equivalent to a human being. A person is instead a self-conscious agent who can provide reasons for her actions and can ask other people their reasons for acting, and who has full rights and responsibilities. So on this concept of a person, a 2-year-old human being is not a person. If a 2-year-old hits someone, we don't charge them with assault. Conversely, just as there may be human beings who aren't persons, or there are human beings who aren't persons, there may also be persons who aren't human being a biological concept. For instance, perhaps there are intelligent space aliens due to land on Earth at any moment and just put us to shame with the heights of self-consciousness they've achieved. The question about persons, which this talk most closely concerns, is this: what makes each of us a single person? What makes me one person even if I'm fiercely torn on all kinds of political issues, for instance, or even if I'm incredibly moody? Now, this is a question we obviously don't normally ask. We normally just assume that where there's one adult human being, there's one person. But in the normal sort of case, we're dealing with the easy case, and the hard cases can make us hesitate. So conjoined twins are one sort of hard case for thinking about the identity and individuation of persons. Individuation being the picking out as distinct and unique individuals. So, for instance, you may be tempted to say, well, what makes each of us a single human being is that we each have one body. But Brittany and Abigail Hensel, pictured here with Abigail on your left and Brittany on your right, are conjoined twins who, by many reasonable criteria, share a body. They have one torso, they have one pair of legs between them, they have one pair of arms between them. They share a circulatory system. If Abigail drinks coffee, Brittany feels jittery. Yet they are, as I think you can ascertain even from this picture, distinct persons. So here we have Abigail is the more extroverted of the two. She's chatting with a friend from college, and Brittany is checking her text messages. It can't be true, in other words, we can tell from Brittany and Abigail, that to be a single person is to have a single body. Now, of course, Brittany and Abigail, as you saw in this picture, have different heads and different brains. So you might be tempted to think, well, what makes each of us a single person is that we each have one brain. But there are other cases of conjoinment that challenge this proposal too. So here you have a picture of Tatiana and Krista Hogan. You have Tatiana on your left, Krista on your right. The girls are joined at the level of the thalamus. The thalamus has been called the sensory relay of the brain because all perceptual modalities, with the exception of olfaction, pass through the thalamus on the way to the cerebral hemispheres. As a result, the girls have an unusual access to each other's perceptual experiences. So, for instance, at least when the girls were the age they are pictured here, I don't know what their current tastes are. Krista liked the taste of ketchup, Tatiana didn't. So when Krista would eat ketchup, Tatiana would cry and try to scrape it off her tongue. Even though the ketchup wasn't on her tongue, it was on her sister's tongue. So their brains are at a minimum intimately connected, and indeed, as you can tell again from this single anecdote, their minds are connected too, yet they're nonetheless clearly developing into distinct persons. And there are other cases too that suggest that to be a single person is not just to have a single brain. The real-life hard case I'm going to be talking about today is, as I mentioned, the split brain case. Subjects who have undergone split brain surgery. And the reason that the split brain case is another hard case for thinking about persons is that many people have argued or intuited that a split brain subject after the surgery has two minds, a right hemisphere mind and a left hemisphere mind. So I'm going to use the split brain phenomenon in this talk to address a third possible account of what makes each of us a single person. And according to this third account, what makes each of us a single person is that we each have a single mind. So clearly, to be a person isn't just to have a mind, because lots of things have minds that aren't persons. My pet rabbit has a mind of a primitive sort, and yet it's not a person. What is a mind? Well, in the same way that your legs are what allow you to walk and your stomach is what digests food for you, your mind is that part of you which thinks and perceives and experiences and decides and forms intentions to act and so on. Or if you prefer, your mind is that in virtue of which you think and perceive and experience and decide and form intentions to act. While to be a person clearly isn't just to have a mind, persons at least have special kinds of minds. So most relevantly for this talk, a person has a self-conscious mind, a mind that can think of itself and think of itself as a mind, or a mind that can reflect on its own mental states. So one possible proposal is that what makes each of us a single person is that we each have a single one of these special kinds of minds, a self-conscious mind, most relevantly for this talk. But I think that the split brain case shows that this too is false, and that a single person can in fact have multiple self-conscious minds. So here's the way the rest of the talk will go. First, I'll present a prehistory of the split brain phenomenon that situates it with respect to two different debates about the relationship we bear to our brains. And then I will describe the kind of investigation you need to do of split brain subjects that most clearly reveals the long-term psychic consequences of split brain surgery. Next, I will argue that in fact there are two systems, two psychological subjects, two entities within a split brain subject whom I'll call Lefty and Righty, each of whom in fact does have a distinct mind. And finally, in the last section on self-consciousness in split brain subjects, I will argue that although a split brain subject doesn't just have two minds, but in fact two self-conscious minds, in neither mind is self-consciousness used to distinguish itself from the other. Rather, they both respond to and relate to each other as if they belong to a single self-conscious mind. And counterintuitively, this mutual ignorance, which I call lack of mutual recognition, acts to make them parts of a single person, a single one of us. First, what's the relationship between everyone in this room, we persons, and our brains? I bet a lot of you, maybe even all of you at this point, have thought about this issue in some way. Since we live, after all, in neuromantic times, times in which there's a great deal of optimism and enthusiasm in some quarters for the notion that neuroscience will eventually come to explain every interesting facet of human life. So not just learning and perception, not even just personality and the nature of personal memory, but the value of art, the meaning of morality, the experience of love, and so on. And the most extreme view in this area, it's extreme, although it has a lot of proponents, is the view that in fact, in some fundamental sense, we just are our brains. And you could encapsulate this position with the slogan, self-understanding through neuroscience. Such extreme views also have many detractors. So Alva Noe, for instance, argues, of course, we have brains, and they're very important to us. Nonetheless, we aren't, in any sense, reducible to our brains. Noe argues it's not just that we can't explain every interesting facet of human life in terms of neural activities. We can't really ultimately explain any interesting facet of human life solely in terms of neural activities. We need to look also at the bodies that our nervous systems are embedded within, to put it extremely mildly. And we also need to look at the physical and social environments in which we live, in which we simultaneously construct as they in turn construct us. Note that in this debate between these two positions, there are really in fact two different debates. So one is the debate between materialism and anti-materialism. The materialist position being the one according to which we are fully physical beings, and the anti-materialist position being one according to which we also have some sort of immaterial, non-physical aspect. But a second debate in this area is one between reductionism and anti-reductionism. So even if we are purely physical beings, does that mean that we are most fundamentally our brains, as the reductionist says, or are we more than this? Is it impossible to reduce ourselves as a whole to some important, but again, nonetheless, still very partial aspect of the animals we are? These two debates between materialism and anti-materialism on the one hand, and between reductionism and anti-reductionism on the other hand, both concern the relationship that we bear to our brains. But really, of course, they concern the relationship that our minds bear to our brains. Everyone knows that our lungs are fully material things, and that breathing doesn't reduce to neural activities, even though there are, of course, parts of the brain that control breathing rate. The question that is really up for grabs here is whether there's an element of human psychology, the mind, the spirit, the soul, the rational intellect, which either isn't fully physical, or even if it is, which doesn't reduce simply to neural activity. By the 19th century, everyone accepted that the brain was the organ of the mind in some sense. So for instance, people realized that in the same way that if you injure my leg, I have trouble walking, they realized by then that if you injure my brain, I'll have trouble thinking or seeing, or my personality will change, or something like that. So they knew that the mind was more intimately related to the brain than to other organs of the body. But the precise nature of that relationship was still unclear. So some people argued, then as now, that the mind just was the brain. Many people also argued that the mind and brain instead merely causally interacted. So a kind of silly analogy, but you might think of the brain as something like an incredibly sophisticated remote control system for the body, via which the mind moves the body and from which it receives multimodal perceptual feedback in order to rationally control the body's movements. And one of the things that made the mind-brain relationship unclear in the 19th century was this. This, by the way, had been noted as a puzzle by much earlier thinkers, but it became a subject of really fierce debate in the 19th century. So on the one hand, our minds are, we assume, unitary or single or one. So to take an example, if you ask me what I want for lunch and I say, I definitely want tacos, you don't say, okay, noted, and then blink and making eye contact again say, and what do you want for lunch? You assume that there is one wanter within me, right? It has spoken with confidence, and there is no other wanting thing within me whose opinion you also need to check in order to avoid offending anyone. So on the one hand, then as now, we assume that our minds are single. That is, that each of us has just a single mind. On the other hand, the brain was visibly, structurally double or dual. So these are, again, the two cerebral hemispheres. The right side is the front of the brain, so you're looking at the right hemisphere on the bottom and the left hemisphere on the top. So this was the question that, again, became the subject of fierce debate in the 19th century. How can the mind be unitary or double if the mind is dual? Three possibilities were debated, and the first was, in fact, that the unity of mind is itself an illusion. That, in fact, we each have two minds apiece rather than one, a right hemisphere mind and a left hemisphere mind. This position was defended most explicitly and at greatest length by Wigan in the mid-19th century in a book with a plain yet provocative title and a very long subtitle, The Duality of Mind, proved by the structure, function, and diseases of the brain, and by the phenomena of mental derangement, and shown to be essential to moral responsibility. So Wigan argued in this very ambitious book that each of us, again, has two minds, a right hemisphere mind and a left hemisphere mind, and that psychic health consists in the harmonious cooperation of these two minds. And a large part of the book is devoted to arguing on a case-by-case basis that all kinds of mental disorder and derangement, as he said, could be accounted for in terms of the breakdown of this cooperation, in terms of these two minds beginning to compete and conflict with each other, and one of these minds becoming dominant. So this, again, was the first possible answer to this puzzle. How can the mind be unitary when the brain is dual? And the position was that, in fact, the mind is dual too. Even then, however, this was something of a fringe position. A second, more popular possibility was that, well, the brain is double or dual and the mind is unitary, and there is no conflict there because the mind and the brain are distinct things. So those who wanted to maintain the anti-materialist, or at least the anti-reductionist position, were in fact somewhat heartened by the fact that the structure of the brain appeared to be so different from what we know the structure of the mind to be. Proponents of the third possible option, meanwhile, who wanted to retain both the unity of the mind on the one hand, unlike Wigan, and the materiality of the mind and potentially its identity of the brain, were in turn heartened by something else about the brain structure. They were heartened by the fact that the two hemispheres appeared to be largely but not totally separated. So here again is another section of the brain. This is a vertical section taken from somewhere near the front, so about there. And again, you're seeing the right hemisphere on your left, the left hemisphere on your right. There's a lot of right-left talk in this presentation and a lot of mirror reversals, and I apologize for that. That's just the nature of the topic. As you can see, if you look at this, you'll have an immediate impression, I think, of a kind of mirrored doubleness, but you'll also see a big white band of fibers connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. And this fiber tract is called the corpus callosum. And there are, again, other fiber tracts also directly connecting the two cerebral hemispheres at the cortical level, but the corpus callosum is the biggest of these. In fact, the corpus callosum is the largest fiber tract in the human brain. So this was the third position, that the brain isn't really dual either, that the brain itself is made one, unitary, via the corpus callosum. And again, this position allows you to retain the materiality of the mind on the one hand, and potentially its identity with the brain, and the oneness of the mind on the other. But this third position, note, makes an empirical hypothesis also, and it's a hypothesis that can't be confirmed by mere visual inspection of the brain. The hypothesis that is made by this third account is that the corpus callosum doesn't just physically connect the two hemispheres of the brain, but in fact psychically unifies them also, making what would otherwise have been two minds into one. But of course, if this is your hypothesis, it raises an interesting test question. What would happen if you got rid of the corpus callosum? And this too was debated in the 19th century when the, among other things, famous experimental psychologist Gustav Fechner argued that the human mind would be duplicated if the commissures were cut, duplicated or doubled, divided, for much the same reason that a worm continues as two separate living entities if cut in half. The conjecture is essentially a mechanistic one. Dividing the brain should also divide the mind. The British psychologist William McDougall, on the other hand, argued that the mind would remain unified if the brain were split, and even offered to demonstrate this by undergoing the surgery himself if he were to contract an incurable disease. And you might stop to say, well, I mean, how confident could he have been? He only volunteered to undergo the surgery if he was already terminal. But agreeing to undergo any kind of surgery in the 19th century, particularly brain surgery, actually took a lot of confidence. Nonetheless, no one took McDougall up on his offer. So then as now, there was, we can say, a kind of stigma against cutting open the brains of living prominent men just to settle some kind of theoretical curiosity. In the 20th century, however, the first, again, split brain surgeries were performed. These surgeries were not performed to settle some kind of metaphysical bet. They were, again, performed for medically necessary reasons. However, many of the subjects, after undergoing the surgery, generously agreed to act as participants in ongoing psychobehavioral research about the consequences of sectioning the corpus callosum. The results of these studies are famous and famously fascinating, and the studies were immediately brought into a much longer-standing philosophical and at times theological dialogue about the unity of the mind and the nature of the self and so on. And two questions were most prominent. First, does splitting the brain split the mind? And second, does that mean, if so, that there are somehow two of us woven together within a single split-brain human being? Okay, so first, what are the consequences of split brain surgery? Again, split brain subjects are subjects in whom, in all cases, the corpus callosum and in some cases, additional fiber tracts connecting the two hemispheres have been separated. Fortunately, most subjects who underwent the surgery did experience some benefit from it. Most of them experienced some significant reduction in seizure severity and oftentimes seizure frequency also. After the initial recovery period, meanwhile, the standard line has always been that in their day-to-day lives, just going about their lives in the world, the subjects don't generally behave in a particularly remarkable fashion. They're not so obviously distinguishable from anyone else. Clear long-term consequences of split brain surgery emerge only under carefully controlled experimental conditions. Under the controls characteristic of the split brain experiment, perceptual information is carefully directed to only a single hemisphere at a time, to the extent possible. This is quite easy to do in the case of tactile sensation, the sense of touch from the hand. All you do is blindfold a split brain subject or in some way obscure his hands from his sight, and then you can present objects for him to feel in one or the other or both of his hands. Each hand sends tactile, fine-grained touch information directly to the opposite hemisphere. So from the right hand to the left hemisphere, and from the left hand to the right hemisphere. Then you can test for the subject's experience of these objects, for instance, using some kind of manual behavior on the part of the subjects, like pointing or drawing a picture or writing or tapping a button. And in a similar way, motor control is also crossed. So the right hand is primarily controlled by the left hemisphere, and the left hand is primarily controlled by the right hemisphere. There's a similar story to be told in the visual realm. So if you are looking at a point in space, like right now you're all focusing on my face, let's say. If you keep your eyes locked on my face, you can nonetheless see things to the right and the left of my face. As it turns out, everything that you see to the right of where you're looking in your right visual field is being sent directly to your left hemisphere. Everything you see to the left of wherever your eyes are focused is being sent directly to your right hemisphere. Of course, in your case, you presumably have a corpus callosum, so it doesn't really matter. This allows either hemisphere to gain access to the information that only a single hemisphere initially received. But in a split brain subject in whom the corpus callosum is missing, this information more or less stays put in the hemisphere that initially received it, with some interesting results. So let me give you a single very famous example. So in this experiment, a split brain subject sits looking at a screen, and I'm not sure if all of you can see this, but there is a central fixation point in the middle of the screen. This is just the point on which the subject is to lock his eyes for the duration of the trial, so until the screen goes blank. While the subject focuses his eyes on the central fixation point, two images are flashed simultaneously on the screen, one to the left and one to the right of this central fixation point. In this case, a picture of a bird claw or a chicken claw was flashed to the right of the fixation point, and a picture of, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it should look very familiar to us here. It's a picture of a house and a car covered in snow, and there's a snowman out in front too, so it's a snow scene. And this is flashed again in the left visual field. And then the screen goes dark, and you want to ask the subject what it is he saw. Suppose you first do this verbally. You ask the subject just, verbally out loud, so what did you see on the screen? The subject will say that he saw a bird claw or a chicken claw, which was presented in the right visual field and which was received or seen by the left hemisphere. The subject will say nothing about the snow scene. Even if you ask, did you see anything else? The subject will say no. Why is that? That's because the snow scene presented in the left visual field was seen only by the right hemisphere. And in the large majority of the population, the right hemisphere is mute. It lacks a capacity for spoken language, but it can indicate its experience via other means. So suppose you now, as was done here, present an array of images to the subject that he can look at in free vision. That is, he can, move his eyes wherever he wants. And you ask the subject to point to the picture that goes with what he saw on the screen. What happens is that using the right hand, the left hemisphere points to a picture of a chicken, but using the left hand, the right hemisphere points to a picture of a shovel. And then when you ask the subject, so why did you point to what you pointed to, the left hemisphere, which has seen both itself and the right hemisphere point, using the left hand to the shovel, the left hemisphere says, oh, that's easy. I saw a chicken claw, and so I selected a chicken. And you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. Now, the experimenter watching this knows that that is not why the subject pointed to the shovel. The subject pointed to the shovel because the right hemisphere pointed to the shovel, because the right hemisphere saw a snow scene and decided that a shovel was what went best with this picture. But the left hemisphere doesn't know that, and so it constructs a plausible-sounding explanation for why he might have pointed to the shovel. Now, I hope that even from this single example, which I have described to you in a very controversial and biasing way, you have what I call the duality intuition, the intuition that there are within a split-brain subject two minds, a right hemisphere mind and a left hemisphere mind. And I say that I've described it in a controversial and biasing way because I said things like this, that, oh, the right hemisphere saw a picture of a snow scene, and so the right hemisphere pointed to a picture of a shovel, but the left hemisphere doesn't know what the right hemisphere saw, and so the left hemisphere invented an explanation. This is a very puzzling and troubling and controversial explanation of these results, although interestingly, it's very difficult to characterize the results without reverting to these terms. It's a controversial way of describing them because it seems to imply that after the surgery, suddenly, it's no longer the subject as a whole, the human being, who sees or thinks or decides or speaks, but that it is instead these two different systems, mere parts of the subject's brain, that are doing so. But is this really possible? Can a mere hemisphere see or think or act or speak? So I believe that there are, in fact, two minds within a split brain subject, one associated with the right hemisphere and one associated with the left. But these minds aren't just hemispheres. They're much larger entities, each of which contains only a single one of these hemispheres. I will call these two entities Lefty and Righty. And I will explain why we should believe that they do, in fact, think and see and speak. Really, there are two questions I need to address in this section. So first of all, I need to answer the preliminary question, is it possible for each hemisphere to be associated with a distinct mind? You know, it could have turned out that, in fact, you need both hemispheres to have a mind. We know from other sorts of unfortunate cases that you need at least one hemisphere to have a mind, and it could have turned out that you need both hemispheres to have a mind. But in fact, there are other sorts of surgical cases that suggest that one hemisphere does not need the participation of the other in order for the human being to have a mind. And then the second thing, I'll explain what these systems are that have the intrinsic capacities necessarily to have minds. And then secondly, I'll explain why we should think that they in fact do have distinct minds. Okay, so here are MRI images of two different people's brains. And as you can see, they've undergone the same very radical type of procedure. So we're seeing both of these people's brains from the back. You can see the cerebellum on the bottom of both images. These people have undergone a procedure called hemispherectomy. Hemispherectomy is the physical removal or else the functional incapacitation of an entire cerebral hemisphere. As you can see, they've undergone a hemispherectomy on different sides. So the person on your left has undergone right hemispherectomy, removal of the right cerebral hemisphere, or again, functional incapacitation of it. Right hemispherectomy is performed somewhat more frequently because in most people, the right hemisphere is the non-dominant hemisphere, especially for language. So surgeons are at least slightly less reluctant to remove the right hemisphere than the left. However, as you can see, people do undergo left hemispherectomy as well, removal of the entire left cerebral hemisphere. Here's a little girl who has recently undergone a hemispherectomy. She's probably about 2 months out, I would estimate, and you may be able to see, depending on where you're sitting, that one side of her face is more expressive than the other. You can see that her smile on this side is, in fact, kind of holding up her mouth as a whole. And no matter where you're seated, you can probably see that she's holding a lunch pail, maybe Dora the Explorer. I don't know, I'm not up on these characters at this point, but she's holding a kind of lunchbox in one hand, and her other hand is in a kind of unusual position. It looks a little limp or stiff. Because the left side of her face is less expressive than the right, and because her right hand is totally functional, but her left hand looks at least partially paralyzed, this suggests that the hemisphere that she had removed was the right hemisphere, since each hemisphere primarily controls the opposite side. Hemispherectomy is more commonly performed on children than on adults, and there's a number of reasons for this, but one reason for this is that children have the benefit of neuroplasticity, and so they're thought to recover much better from hemispherectomy. Nonetheless, both right and left hemispherectomy have been performed on adults following periods of normal development, and I think that we can learn a lot from these cases. What you see is that if you take a neurotypical subject and you remove her right hemisphere, she will still be conscious, thinking, she'll act in socially appropriate ways, she'll be responsive, and so on. She may have some trouble with, eventually when you test her, she'll have some deficits of visuospatial processing. She may have some difficulty recognizing certain faces. Primarily what you'll notice is that she has trouble controlling the left side of her body. You'll notice left side paralysis more strikingly. This is when you remove the right hemisphere. Loved ones, by the way, don't report any obvious changes in personality after someone undergoes right hemispherectomy. If you take a neurotypical human being and you instead remove their left hemisphere, you will still be left with a conscious, thinking person who's socially responsive. Loved ones, again, won't report any obvious changes in personality. What will probably be most striking to you when you see someone who's undergone left hemispherectomy is muteness. So the human being will be totally mute at first and then may start to speak some very well-rehearsed phrases and maybe even sing some songs that are well-known, but will still be effectively largely mute for a much longer period of time. However, the human being will still be capable of answering verbal questions by nodding or shaking his head, still be able to grasp tone of voice, know when you're angry, know when you're just joking around. And again, if you remove someone's left hemisphere, you'll notice that now they have some paralysis on the right side of their body. Here's how I think hemispherectomy can help us think about split-brain subjects. So here, outlined in black, is a split-brain subject. Take a split-brain subject, so who has both hemispheres, but they're no longer connected via the corpus callosum, and take the split-brain subject and ignore all the contributions that are made by his right hemisphere. And what you have left over is the entity that I will call Lefty. Lefty isn't just a left hemisphere. Lefty is the entire human being minus the right hemisphere and all of its causal contributions. Lefty has the same intrinsic psychological capacities as a person who has recently undergone right hemispherectomy, removal of the right hemisphere. So I've shaded Lefty in here in red. Again, there's some mirror reversal. So you're seeing Lefty on your right, but we're looking at this person front on. As you can see, again, Lefty is the whole human being, minus I've left white the right hemisphere, and for dramatic idealization, the left hand, which is primarily controlled by the right hemisphere. Now take a split-brain subject and instead consider the entire human being minus all the contributions of his left hemisphere. And what you have is the entity that I will call Righty. Righty has all the same intrinsic psychological capacities as a person who has recently undergone left hemispherectomy, removal of the left hemisphere. So again, here you have Righty, this time shaded in blue. Righty is the entire human being minus the left hemisphere and the right hand, which is primarily controlled by the left hemisphere. Now, Righty and Lefty both exist within a split-brain subject. This is to say that their overlap is not just physical but functional. They both help control various parts of the body, but their overlap isn't complete. This, in and of itself, doesn't show, I don't think, that Righty and Lefty have different minds. For instance, I too contain a Righty and Lefty. I contain a Righty and a Lefty and a corpus callosum, which I left out at the previous discussion because neither split-brain subjects nor hemispherectomy subjects have a corpus callosum. So everyone in this room contains a Righty and a Lefty. Yet we don't, on that basis alone, conclude that we each have two minds. Of course, we also know that in a neurotypical subject, Righty and Lefty's mental activities are integrated via the corpus callosum. And we also know that in the split-brain subject, Righty and Lefty are operating independently of each other, at least to an unusual degree. They lack a lot of access to each other's mental states and a lot of control over each other's actions. So the next question I need to address is, how significant is this independence of Righty and Lefty in the split-brain subject? Do they operate independently enough of each other to have distinct minds? And I believe that they do. And I believe that the reason why they do is because although their mental states interact with each other all the time, the interaction isn't of the sufficiently direct or intimate sort that typifies the workings of a single mind. In particular, they interact with each other mainly because one of them will do something and the other one perceives the response. So we actually already saw an example of this. Recall that in this case, Righty pointed to a picture of the shovel after having seen the snow scene, and Lefty saw Righty point and then tried to infer the psychological cause of the pointing behavior. So Righty's mental states, it's seeing the snow scene, it's deciding that a shovel is the picture that best goes with the snow scene. Righty's mental states did have an impact on Lefty's mental states, and indeed on what Lefty said to the experimenter. But they did this because Righty pointed and Lefty saw Righty do it. And this is the way your mind interacts with mine. So right now, for instance, I'm having lots of thoughts of ideas, and I'm causing you to have various thoughts and ideas. But that's not happening because we're psychically connected or because I have the power of mind control. That's happening because I am articulating my ideas, right? I'm speaking, creating, not to be too reductive, but sound waves in the air, which are, hitting your sensory apparatus and which you are then processing as speech and understanding. For that matter, this is the way Abigail and Brittany's Hensel's mental states interact with each other too. One of them says something or does something and the other perceives it. And that, I think, is the basis of the claim that a split-brain subject has two minds. The Lefty and Righty's mental states, while they interact all the time, are interacting only in this indirect way for the most part. One of them responds in some way and the other perceives the response. So what does this mean about personhood in the split-brain subject? I've argued that Righty and Lefty each have their own mind. Does this mean that Lefty and Righty are each one of us, so that the two together, a split-brain subject as a whole, are like a pair of conjoined twins? I spend the second half of the book arguing that Lefty and Righty don't just have distinct minds, but indeed distinct self-conscious minds, but that they don't recognize each other as distinct self-conscious minds. Now, as for the first claim, typically, people haven't doubted, in fact, I don't know of any case in which anyone has doubted that the left hemisphere is self-conscious. And that's because via their left hemispheres, the subjects can say things where Lefty can say things like, I'm tired, I'm hungry, I don't want to participate in this experiment anymore, right? So via their left hemispheres, the subjects can speak about their left hemisphere mental states using the first person pronoun, obvious indicators of the self-consciousness that is required for personhood. It's always the psychological status and sophistication of poor silent righty that's called into question in these debates. But there's a little-known experimental study that I think shows pretty conclusively that righty, too, is self-conscious. So in this experiment, there were 2 split-brain subjects in this experiment who were asked a series of questions about their values, their likes and dislikes, and their emotional lives. And they were responding to these questions manually. So in each case, the subject's hand were behind a screen so that neither righty nor lefty could see either hand. And before each hand was a series of 5 horizontally oriented pegs, which the subjects were trained to use as like the equivalent of a multiple choice scantron, tapping the rightmost peg to signify very much and the leftmost peg to signify not at all. And then the subjects were asked questions like, how much do you believe in God? How much do you like taxes? And questions like, how much do you feel lonely? How much do you feel respected? What happened was that, particularly for the more emotionally sensitive questions, the left hand and the right hand of each subject would give different patterns of responses. Moreover, each hand's pattern of responses was itself internally consistent. This suggests that the left hand responses were in fact being controlled by righty because they were different from the right hand responses. And because these responses were internally consistent, it suggests that righty really did understand and sensibly answer the questions. These questions, especially things like how much do you feel lonely, how much do you feel sad, are straightforwardly introspective questions. They require righty to think of itself not just as a physical object in the world, but as a mind, as a being with a mental life, and they require righty to be able to think about its own mental states. So again, I think that this is very conclusive evidence that righty too has a capacity for the most sophisticated kind of self-consciousness that there is, psychological self-consciousness, which is unique to persons. As for the second question, the claim that righty and lefty don't recognize each other as distinct self-conscious minds or even as distinct minds, this is a little harder because there are lots of cases in which lefty appears to regard the left hand, primarily controlled by righty, as an independent and obnoxious agent of a certain kind. So I think there's lots of different examples of this, but here's a single one. This subject complained, my right hand has always been under control. Of course, I should note explicitly, this is obviously lefty speaking. My right hand has always been under control. My left hand, I have to fight with it. If I'm holding something, if I'm reading, I can hold the book in my right hand. It's a lot easier to sit on my left hand than to try to hold it with both hands. I compensate for everything that's wrong or feels wrong. One hand that fights you, I cannot use it a lot. If I had to lose an arm, I'd rather lose the left arm than my right arm. The right one knows what I want it to do, and it does it. With your right hand, you correct what the left has done. So the reason I say, and I accept this actually, that lefty does regard the left hand as a quasi-autonomous agent. The reason I say this is because lefty here will say things like, I go to do something with my right hand being just a sort of implement which fulfills my agency, and then my left hand stops me. Independent intentions are being attributed to the left hand. So I concede that lefty does, in lots of different cases, appear to regard the left hand as an independent agent, at least of a primitive kind. But it never seems to occur to lefty that it actually shares its left hand with another self-conscious mind. Lefty never, for instance, tries to reason with the left hand to say like, hey, can we just read for 15 minutes and then we'll just do whatever you want? Instead, at most, in a lot of different cases, lefty will handle the behavior it regards as wayward of the left hand by sitting on the left hand or by slapping it with the right hand. That is not how well-socialized adults handle interpersonal conflict, by sitting on each other. But lefty clearly doesn't think of the left hand as shared between it and another person. Instead, lefty's just thinking, this is my hand, the hand's not acting the way I want it to, I'm just going to take care of this however I can. I call this lack of mutual recognition. So this is why I say that Lefty and Righty assume that the split-brain subject is one person, one self-conscious mind, reasons-giving, morally responsible, and each thinks I am that person. Lefty and Righty's failure to recognize each other as distinct self-conscious minds and as distinct reasons-giving agents means two things. So first, it means that, as I just described, they don't relate to each other as distinct persons. So for instance, they don't talk about what they should do. Lefty never asks Righty or the left hand, hey, why did you do that? Explain yourself. It also means that each of them accepts responsibility for and self-attributes not just its own, but the other's responses as well. So let me again give a single dramatic example of this. This experiment used the split-brain subject PS, who's a very interesting split-brain subject because he's one of these subjects who learned to generate some speech out of his right hemisphere also. So Righty as well as Lefty can speak. Righty, there's no subject in whom Righty is as fluent as Lefty. Lefty's always dominant for language, but there are some split-brain subjects who learn how to speak to some extent out of the right hemisphere. So in this experiment, split-brain PS sits, again, looking at a screen, and once again, he keeps his eyes fixated the whole time on a dot, which is at the center of the screen, and a series of 5 word pairs are presented to PS as he looks at the screen, one on the left and one on the right of the central fixation point. And the words have been carefully selected so as to, in effect, tell 3 different stories. So if you read the words from left to right, from first to last, which is how a neurotypical subject would read them, the story spelled would be, Marianne may come visit into the township today. Or if you just look at the right visual field words, the words that are seen by Lefty, the story told is, Anne come into town today. Or if you just look at the left visual field words, the words that are seen only by Righty, the story told is, Mary may visit the ship. And then the screen finally goes dark, and the split-brain subject is asked, so what did you see? What happens is Lefty, still dominant for language, speaks first, and Lefty says totally fluently, nails it, and come into town today. No hesitation. But then with repeated prodding, Righty starts articulating what it saw too. So first the experimenter says, sorry, I'm going to have to shift over here. First, I see like the sound people freaking out. I'll try to be extremely loud during just this portion. Okay, so first the experimenter says, what else? And Righty says, on a ship. Who? Righty says, Ma. There was no Ma seen in the left visual field, but there was both a Mary and a May, so presumably Righty is getting the Ma from that. The experimenter says, what else? And Righty says, to visit. The experimenter says, what else? And Righty says, to see Marianne. This is already quite interesting because neither Righty nor Lefty saw both Mary and Anne. And Anne, in particular, appeared in the right visual field seen by Lefty. But Lefty already spoke, and Righty heard Lefty speak. And so what Righty appears to be doing is combining now the Mary that Righty saw with the Anne that Lefty spoke earlier. Now the experimenter says, now repeat the whole story. And we assume this is Lefty speaking again now because it's a grammatically very complex sentence, and so presumably only within the syntactic processing capacities of Lefty. Lefty says, Ma ought to come into town today to visit Marianne on the boat. This is very interesting because it's quite different from, among other things, it's quite different from the sentence that Lefty originally said. Among other things, Anne was the object of the subject, rather, of Lefty's first answer, and is now the object. And Lefty could have, in principle, it seems, stuck to its guns, right, and said, well, I saw Anne come into town today, but you kept harassing me, so I felt like I should make some other stuff up. Or Lefty could have said, for that matter, well, I saw Anne come into town today, and the other guy must have seen all that other stuff. But that's not what Lefty does. Instead, Lefty treats everything that both it and Righty said as attempts to articulate a single lived experience. And Lefty now tries to weave those individual articulations into a single overarching narrative that accounts for the experiences of the split-brain human being as a whole. Now, you might say this again was the that Lefty was under a kind of social pressure or bias here, because the experimenter did say at the end, now repeat the whole story, singular, which really encourages Lefty to, again, treat all these as articulations of a single story. But this kind of social pressure is hardly unique to the experimental context. The split-brain subject, and indeed all of us, are subject to this kind of social pressure all the time to, when asked, provide an accounting of everything we've done, even things that we're just not sure why we did them or things that we wish we hadn't done. Brittany and Abigail, on the other hand, are not subject to this kind of social pressure. In fact, quite the opposite. So here's their mother, Patty, who's pictured here, has spoken about this at length. I really like this photo. This is Patty leaning forward to kiss the girls who were adolescents at the time, and they're like recoiling in horror. And Patty's spoken at great length about the ways in which they really fought particularly hard to make sure the girls had totally distinct senses of themselves as individual persons. So, for instance, among other things, she said when one of the girls would misbehave when they were children, she would be very careful to discipline just that child, even if the other had been inevitably and literally dragged along into the misbehavior. They were bought separate birthday cakes, even though they have not just the same birth date, but the same moment of birth. Their parents also bought them, this kind of blows my mind, not just different seats, different tickets at movie theaters, but on planes, even though they can only occupy a single seat. They wanted, again, to really encourage them to continue thinking of themselves as distinct persons. And she talks about this, for instance, in this quote, that when children ask the girls whether they have two heads, they say that they don't, but that each has their own head. That's what we have encouraged them to do, to develop their own individuality as much as possible. In other words, the girls don't think of themselves as one person with two heads. They think of themselves as two persons, each with one head. Partly, I think, as a result of these experiences in childhood and the way they were raised, Abigail and Brittany Hensel clearly relate to each other as siblings, usually cooperatively, sometimes not, sometimes with some squabbling. When Abby says, for instance, "I don't like that one," she doesn't use the I to refer to Brittany also. Her I is instead used to distinguish herself from her sister. This is quite different, again, from what occurs in the split brain case, in which Lefty uses I to refer to the split brain human being as a whole, and about whom Lefty therefore weaves a single narrative that, again, incorporates both its own and the other's responses. So I've argued that a split brain subject has two minds, and the basis of this argument was that although the mental states of the two minds interact all the time, they don't do so in the particularly intimate way that we assume typifies the workings of a single mind. I have also argued that Lefty and Righty are self-conscious. That is, each is conscious of itself as a psychological subject with mental states. Neither recognizes the existence of a second self-conscious mind within the split-brain subject, however. And my conclusion is that a split-brain subject is therefore one of us. And there are, again, two aspects to the unity of split-brain personhood. One is that because of lack of mutual recognition, Lefty and Righty don't relate to each other as distinct persons via distinctively interpersonal practices such as the exchange of reasons. And the other is that because they both identify with the split-brain human being as a whole, they present to other parties a single overarching narrative that incorporates both of their actions. Thank you very much.
Fantastic talk. Thank you very much. My question is this. Are you familiar with unihemispheric slow-wave sleep? Is anybody familiar with this?
Do you mean in dolphins or in people?
Well, actually, it occurs in cetaceans, which are dolphins and whales. As you may know, that from the beluga whale on up, the brains are larger than the human brain. And when they sleep, and obviously they can't really sleep the way we do, or they'll drown. So when they sleep, one hemisphere at a time is put to sleep. The other hemisphere is awake, and dolphins have been seen swimming in a circle where the inner to the circle hemisphere is asleep in the entire school of dolphins, and then they'll reverse it when they put the other hemisphere to sleep. This occurs in birds. There are many species where they do this, because otherwise they would be subject to predators. So although they're asleep one half at a time, so my question is really, given that familiarity, is there something we can learn from these animals that will pertain to the split brain?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really interesting. So I knew that there were animals in whom one hemisphere would sleep at a time, but I didn't know that they'd also evolved to sort of protect that hemisphere in a certain way. Yeah, that's amazing. I think that result is sort of, I mean, it sounds a little bit like the hemispherectomy case, insofar as I think it shows what something like hemispherectomy shows, i.e. that you don't need both hemispheres to have a mind. Unless, I mean, I guess it would depend on the kind of behavior that they're capable of when only one hemisphere is sleeping. You might think that it's something like sleepwalking, I'm not really sure. But I think that at most that would show, though many philosophers have disagreed with me, that you don't need both hemispheres to have a mind, that either mind in the absence of the other is capable of supporting a mind. However, I personally don't think that that shows that such animals, for instance, do have two minds when both are awake, because I would also want to know, okay, but when both are conscious and functioning, how are they interacting with each other? It's quite interesting, though, and I would be really interested to look at that. It's particularly interesting that you seem to suggest that it's connected to the size of their brains.
Just one other comment. The corpus callosum in all of these animals is much smaller than in the human brain. There's much less connectivity.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you so much. I will definitely look into that. Thank you. Sarah.
You've focused on split brain surgery. Have you looked at all? Is there any lessons to be learned from people who are born without a corpus callosum, please?
Yeah, that's a great question, too. Yeah, that's not an uncommon condition, actually, agenesis of the corpus callosum. The standard line is, and I think there's been some pushback against this view only in the past 15 years, but you certainly see many fewer disconnection effects in subjects with agenesis of the corpus callosum, as it's called. And interestingly, there appears to be a kind of reversal with respect to which signs or symptoms you see. So for instance, I've simplified some amount in this talk. There actually is more direct interhemispheric interaction in the split brain subject, somewhat more than I've described here. It typically involves some kind of non-conscious implicit processing. Consciousness appears to be strongly divided in the split brain subject, strongly dual. Apparently in subjects with agenesis of the corpus callosum, things are reversed. So you see unity of consciousness on the one hand, but when you test for subtler implicit types of processing, you actually do see some division. Some people have argued from the relative unity of mind in agenesis of the corpus callosum against the duality claim for split brain subjects, but I don't see why that follows given neuroplasticity. Other structures in subjects who are born without a corpus callosum may come to play something of the integrating role that is normally played by the corpus callosum.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice talk. This is sort of a trivial question, I guess, but I'm just curious if it's been looked at specifically. Is the two hemispheres having different memories, meaning learning new things, such that, I guess it's sort of obvious maybe than some of the tasks, but I wonder if that's really been demonstrated, that a memory really is only here and not over there.
Yeah, thank you so much. You can imagine, again, a way in which the brain could have been whereby you divide, you test and you see at the time that the hemispheres are subject to different experiences, and yet suddenly a week later, Lefty suddenly recalls, oh, I think I saw a snow scene on the left. Maybe that's why I pointed to the shovel, right? Where memory acts to unify the hemispheres' experiences across time, but that's not what happens. Tested weeks later, they retain their own experiences. Of course, usually outside of experimental context, they'll be looking around at the same world, so they may form similar kinds of memories just via seeing the same thing and so on. But again, I think that will happen in Brittany and Abigail too. There's also differences in the emotional experiences of the two hemispheres, which may lead to them laying down different kinds of memories. And of course, there's certain cognitive perceptual differences between them too. Yeah, thank you.
So it sounds like you're in the mechanistic wheelhouse and not the anti-mechanistic wheelhouse, or?
I consider myself, I consider this argument an argument for materialism, but actually against reductionism. So I think, yes, there are two minds, but there is one person, because the person is something that is constructed out of, or that arises from, these two minds identifying with each other and with the human being as a whole, about whom, again, they tell this certain kind of narrative, which I also think is important to personhood. It's a kind of odd position, but I do identify minds with brains, but not persons. I don't think, and so in that sense, I'm with Noe on this. If you want to know things about, really, again, almost every interesting aspect of human life, probably every interesting aspect of human life, of course you want to understand the hard wiring of the brain, but you can't just look at that, but at the way we continually self-interpret, partly as a result of other people's understanding of us also. So again, I think in that sense, I'm a mechanist/materialist, but anti-reductionist.
Have there ever been any efforts to communicate directly with whichever brain it is that can't talk?
Righty, yeah.
Chimpanzees can't talk,
yeah.
but you can teach them sign language, and you can teach them to move things around and respond to questions.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, so there have been, and it's worth noting that you can't get interesting results with all split-brain subjects, and it seems to depend on the verbal capacity that the right hemisphere has. With very minimal capacity, it can to understand the questions. It's hard to tell how typical that is of the human brain, because these subjects have experienced some ongoing brain damage due to the severity of the seizures before undergoing the surgery. But so far as I know, in all the subjects in whom you do get these interesting results, Righty can in fact communicate. You can ask Righty questions about, I was just reading about one yesterday again, who's your favorite girl? What's your favorite car? You can also ask questions about what is your mood? How much do you like Nixon? Get slight disagreement between Righty and Lefty there. Righty doesn't like Nixon, but Lefty really doesn't like Nixon, was the result you get apparently. Yeah, so Righty can answer either by, again, something like the equivalent of, tapping and, yes, very much, or no, not at all, or somewhere in between, by tapping yes or no. In many subjects, Righty can actually write using the left hand very painstakingly, but can write out words. Or you can give Righty block letters this is a little easier, to arrange into words, and Righty can spell the words out. So yes, Righty just literally can't speak in most cases, but can certainly communicate even verbally in other ways.
I started some research to find out about sickness, and I ran into Carl Jung, and he talks about the introverted and the extrovert. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that nature has a lot of duality, 2 legs, 2 feet, 2 eyes, etc. Yep. And apparently, they play against one another and work fine. In questions, where the mind has to decide on a bear coming this way, a squirrel over here, and one side sees, the left brain sees one and the right brain sees the other one, a decision has to be made. Yeah. And, does that decision bounce back and forth?
This is quite interesting, and this is actually something that I should know more about, this kind of theoretical background about why there are 2 hemispheres to begin with. I mean, a lot of it presumably just has to do with just developmental facts. So bilateral symmetry is quite easy to develop. You just have everything move out from the center. And I think that might be part of the reason why, actually, if you look at the brain, almost everything in it is bilaterally symmetric in that way. However, the cross-wiring of the brain is certainly more puzzling. Why it is that each hemisphere primarily controls and receives feedback from the opposite side of the body. And the longest standing theory was Cahal's, that it had something to do with the fact that your lens actually inverts the visual image, so that if you didn't then move the right visual field to the left hemisphere and the left visual field to the right hemisphere, you wouldn't see things joined at the midline. Instead, the inside would be here and here on the outside, and in the center you'd have the edges of the field. The most recent thing I've read on this actually suggests, this is kind of mind-blowing, but everything in development and evolution is, that instead the explanation may be that a common ancestor that was a fish and was swimming in one orientation was either like a horizontal swimmer or a vertical swimmer on its side, switched directions, actually slowly moved its body 90 degrees, made a 90-degree shift for some sort of reason, either to avoid detection or for some other reason. And then at that point, its eyes were then located in the wrong position, and so were its fins, and that its body and brain corrected for this 90-degree off rotation by moving in different directions until the brain was cross-wired. And I think it's turning out that a certain number of things in the brain that we originally thought could be accounted for in functional terms, like, oh, maybe it's good to have two in order to separately control the arms and the legs, are maybe instead explained best in terms of genetic development terms. Though that said, you're right that one of the results you get in split brain subjects that's quite interesting is that they can more easily do different things with their two hands at once than a neurotypical subject can. Our hands tend to move in the same way when we move them, or one just plays a supporting role. Piano players have to unlearn that. They have to learn to decouple their hands. Each hemisphere begins to operate more independently of the other in terms of manual control of the hands. And maybe having two hemispheres does allow a greater degree of manual independence than would be possible if you just had a single, totally unified brain. I'm not sure.
You know, also, when you look at the genes, you've got two alleles, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's interesting, too, because both in the 19th century, there's a great book by Anne Harrington on this, and this happened again in the 20th century with the split brain cases. A part of the fascination had to do with the apparent twinning of mind. And twins have always been really fascinating to people. Apparently, cross-culturally, hands, the fact that they look the same, they look like mirror images of each other, and yet one of them is almost always dominant. This has really fascinated people across cultures. So I do think that this does account for part of the intuitive fascination of the split brain cases.
Thank you. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I was curious, what happens in the dream state? What does Lefty and Righty think about this? I mean, do they have the same dream? Or?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the emotional content would presumably be similar, because part of experiencing an emotion is a kind of somatic response, you know, the way when you're nervous, your stomach clenches and so on. And both Lefty and Righty have access to, they receive somatic information from the body. So they tend to have undergo the same emotional experiences, even if only one of them knows why. So there's a famous case in which Righty alone is shown apparently a fire safety film produced by Cornell, which warns employees not to throw each other into fires in the event of a fire. It's apparently very terrifying. Anyway, Righty saw it, and then Lefty expressed feeling very anxious but didn't know why and just blamed it on some surrounding aspect of the situation. However, when it comes to the actual imagistic component of dreams, I would imagine, at least certainly with respect to visual imagery, they would have to be different, because this is not, as it turns out, a way that Lefty and Righty can communicate. Righty can't just think about something really hard, construct a really, vivid mental image of it in order to get Lefty to perceive it. So I think, again, the visual aspect would be separate.
I apologize in advance for a very fuzzy question, but I recall being here 2 or 3 years ago when there was a philosopher from Stanford, and I forget his name, who had written a book about the philosophy of Proust, in which he claimed that Proust had viewed us as having a whole, being composed of many selves, diachronic and synchronic, both. And I find myself, reaching for the peanuts when someone, another part of me says no. And I'm wondering, if you could elaborate on that last thing you said, which makes a split brain person one of us. Because I think, I just, as I go on, I think that we are less and less unified and singular as we really like to think. I think that that's kind of an illusion or something that the brain does, a construct of some sort. Oh, yeah, there's a lot of social stuff in it. And so I'm wondering if you could, maybe if it's a proper sort of question to ask here, if you could tell me a little bit about your theory of what the meaning of what is this one thing.
I don't think that's a fuzzy question at all, though it is quite a big question. I mean, so I would say a few different things here. One is that I will admit that if we were much more psychically unified than we are, it would be harder to argue that a split-brain subject is a single one of us. Now, I do think that so there are, as you said, we all experience, or don't experience, but it goes on anyway, lack of access, right, to the contents of our minds, to our own intentions. We all experience psychic conflict. And there are, still today, prominent scientific psychological models of persons as multiple agents, actually. Models according to which, so I love Ainsley's work on hyperbolic discounting, the ways in which people actually anticipate future failures of their own willpower and so take steps now to thwart their agency later, right? I mean, I guess like the stereotypical example of like freezing your credit cards in a block of ice so that later you won't be able to get to them, right? And they do that as if, right, they're competing with another person whose activities they don't like. So there are other kinds of multiple minds models. It just comes down, ultimately, the difference between the split brain case and these other cases comes down to the kinds of failures of access and integration that there are in this case, and I think more importantly, though this is harder to express, the organization of those failures. Actually, I guess I'll say a third thing too, which makes a difference, is the explanation for it. To some extent, any multiple minds claim for split brain subjects will need to be made relative to what's true of neurotypical subjects. And so you might think, well, to the extent that we are already psychologically multiplicitous or, disunified and so on, it'll be harder and harder to come up with those explanations. But in a lot of those cases, again, the kinds of disunities you see in the split brain case are mostly not, I would say, quantitatively different, but qualitatively different, and the breakdown occurs along different lines, and it has ultimately not some sort of psychodynamic explanation, not really any kind of psychological explanation at all, but a very brute, really ultimately kind of mundane physical explanation. There were these two physical systems. They used to be connected via this large bridge, and now they are no longer connected. At the end of the day, that's the reason that you and I have different minds. There's not some psychological explanation in terms of past trauma or anything like that. It's just we're physically different systems, physically separated. So I guess those are the main things I would say. I would urge, it's true that to a large extent, the unity of the person is something we insist on, even while simultaneously knowing that people aren't as unified as we require them to be. And part of what happens, I think, is that what we expect at a minimum is for people to acknowledge and make amends for their own failures to be integrated. And interestingly, I do think that is part of this account, that what you see in the split brain cases, yeah, Lefty and Righty don't know what each other are thinking, and they may not be able to control each other's behavior, but they apologize as one, right? Anything either of them does, the other says, at a minimum, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I don't know why I did. And I think that that's ultimately socially very important and legally.
I know there are many more questions, and what I would like to suggest now, there's a beautiful reception in the Berkland Lounge, and perhaps we can continue the conversation with Lizzie in a more informal environment, but if now you could join me in thanking Lizzie for a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much.